Hello, welcome to Scott's Odyssey. One of my favorite things to do while driving around Pennsylvania is to stop and actually read the highway historical markers, or as we more commonly call them, the blue signs. It's going to get loud here. This particular blue sign has a title that should cause anyone to slow down or even stop and back up to read it again. That name is The Shadow of Death. I wonder what that could be about. See you in a minute. Welcome back. If you've watched my videos before, thank you for your patronage. And if you're new to Scott's Odyssey, welcome aboard. I hope you enjoy this story regarding the Shadow of Death. Be sure to click subscribe to receive more stories of who we once were.
In 1608, Captain John Smith took an expedition and examined the Susquehanna River from the bottom up, and in 1609, Henry Hudson made the same trek from the top down. Along the way, both met with local natives to talk about the areas around them and reported that the natives expressed fear for what was in and beyond the mountains of the Alleghenies. On the east, you had the Munsee, Lenape, and Susquehannock. To the north, you had the Iroquois and the Erie. But once you reached the Allegheny, the area was considered the territory of the Shawnee and the Ohio Valley tribes. But you normally would not have found a native unless they were scouting or on some sort of attempt to become a brave. The territory was just too harsh and too dangerous. Pennsylvania was so rough that nobody even settled in the state until 1643, and that was by the Swedes in a fort they called Tinicum, in what is now Tinicum Township, part of the Philadelphia International Airport island along what was called the South River, now called the Delaware River, where it met with the Schuylkill River. In the early 1700s, this part of Pennsylvania was a wilderness unlike any that had been seen before. But as exploration continued, the settlers and pioneers slowly moved westward, and likewise, the native scouts, the owners of the territory, increased their scouting eastward. One of the biggest stopgaps in both directions was the Appalachians that made up this part of Pennsylvania. It was, and in some ways still is, a wall between the eastern and western parts of the state. Even now, there is only 3 contiguous roadways that go from east to west through these mountains that are normally separated by 120 miles. I say normally because at some points, the roads actually have to interconnect for a common pass between mountains. Likewise, there are only 2 main roads and 2 minor roads that connect the north to the south, and they are separated by 133 miles except for where those roads interconnect with each other for a common pass through a range or a valley. So needless to say, it is, and more so was, very difficult to travel east and west or north to south once you reach the Allegheny portion of the Appalachian mountain range. At one point, a breakthrough in trails was discovered that opened travel to a huge valley in what is now Huntingdon County. This location became one of the main throughways along the natively named Kittanning Trail, later known as the Frankstown Path, a path created and traveled by the natives that went from the Susquehanna River at ferryman and fur trader John Harris's cabin, a man who later became extremely wealthy enough to establish Harrisburg, all the way to a tribal area called Shanopen, a small town on the Ohio River just north of Pittsburgh occupied by the Indians referred to as the Ohio Valley Natives. This particular location we are at is one of the few that we actually know the name of, but no longer have an accurate account of why it was so named. In this location, we are traveling along the Shade Creek through an extremely tight valley pass under the tail end of the Shade Mountain, which lends name to this area as Shade Gap, a portmanteau of the words Shade Mountain Creek Water Gap. This is an extremely quiet and peaceful little area for the most part. The highway is a high-speed blind turns road, and like I said before, one of the only ways to go north and south in central Pennsylvania. so it does have a good amount of traffic. Another reason I say quiet and peaceful for the most part is because this location is where in 1966 the largest manhunt in the history of the U.S. happened. That was the manhunt for the somewhat touched mountain man, William Diller Hollenbaugh, also known as Bicycle Bill, not Bicycle Pete as the movie calls him, who kidnapped the 17-year-old Peggy Ann Bradnick for 8 days. But we'll visit that story on another video. One of the more interesting finds in this area is a sign with a reference to its older name that goes back to the times of the Frankstown Path. This area is comprised of a rarer type of mountain range than many of the others found throughout Huntingdon County. Within this county, you have mountains that are steep, but with a little effort, traversable. Some of them contain a ton of benches or large flat stepped areas that are easily reached after a 15 or 100-foot steep incline. Some are remnants of large glacial melts that are nothing more than a boulder field and have an incline of nearly 80 degrees, and some that are just rolling smooth hills. But this area is one of an eroded mountain and is full of holes, rock shelters, and small caves. Conrad Weiser was the son of a German Moravian magistrate in Livingston Manor, New York. His father, being magistrate, was often in contact and very friendly with the local Mohawks. In 1712, Conrad was sent to live with a local Iroquois tribe for a short 8 months' time. When the first meeting of the provincial leaders of Pennsylvania and the Iroquois was to take place in 1732, the then 16-year-old Conrad left New York with the Iroquois in order to act as their interpreter, thus establishing his usefulness and essentially his future career. In 1748, on a mission from the provincial government of Pennsylvania in order to establish trade and treaty with the Ohio Valley natives, Conrad maintained a journal of locations along the path that described stopping points and points of interest. Who the first person was to actually name these locations is not known, and most of their names are for reasons that would have been obvious to the traveler of these routes. But Conrad Weiser, because he documented them, is often attributed to the naming origins. Conrad would have walked southwest as he passed through what is now the Trough Springs in Tell Township. To him it was called the Cove Spring, which is apparent to the spring that was in the area and the high-walled valley he walked through being very much like a cove. Later, he would pass through Orbisonia, which he called the Black Log, and today has a mountain marking Orbisonia's borough on the east side called the Black Log Mountain. The area he called Three Springs is currently the borough of Three Springs, and is named after the Three Springs Creek, which is a confluence of 3 other waterways. Current Shirleysburg was called Alwick, and was most likely named something that came from a Scots-Irish origin, but was most definitely not of native origin. But alas, the actual origin of the name is unknown. That leaves us with the Shadow of Death. The location has absolutely no known name origin. By the time Conrad was traveling this path, the name of Shade Mountain was established. And more than likely, the name of Shade Creek was also established, and it's even possible that this pass was known as the Shade Gap. Shadow of Death is claimed to be recorded as the name from Conrad, and possibly other travelers. The prevailing theory for this name was due to the fact that the readily available caves and overhead terrain to this only mountain pass made it easy for natives to attack settlers and travelers, but this also could be a story attribution to when the area was referred to as Locke's Valley and owned by the Locke family repeating such stories. Based on a lot of historically recorded recounts in this county, especially on the western side, and even the story of burnt cabins to the south, this theory holds a lot of weight. But because causation is not based on correlation, without any definitive attacks recorded in this location, it will remain just a simple theory. Working against this theory is that Conrad Weiser was the one who named the location, yet was known by the Indians as the Holder of the Heavens. He was respected and honored by the Indians for being a man of peace and treaty making. Conrad was supposedly the man who named this gap Shadow of Death, because he was the first to record it in a travel journal as such, but he himself never saw such travesty as what the name suggests in the prevailing theory. So unfortunately, we really do not know the origin of the name Shadow of Death. I can and will confirm that there's an odd feeling when you're in this small stretch, but I attribute that to a lack of light and an inability to openly make a determination of what direction you're traveling in when you're here, aside from knowing that the road travels north to south. It is possible that Conrad felt a similar feeling when he made the turn out of the Cove Spring area, where he was channeled into an extremely dark and ominous portion of the trail, with lots of caves and dark spots as you look across the mountain range, and in his Moravian religious teachings, found comfort by quoting scripture to describe the area. A theory that I haven't heard and that I pose is that perhaps it was religiously based. Just 1 mile up the road from this location, there was an unoccupied small cabin that was used on occasion to serve as a house of worship for the local Catholics of Shade Gap. This location was built as early as 1740, when the first priest to serve the Catholics, Father Matthias Manners, came through the area. Due to the growth of Catholics in this area, by 1745, Father Manners was succeeded by Father Frombach and his assistant, Father Dietrich. During this time period, and from what I still hear from modern locals, Catholics were despised as an evil lot of people, and it was not until the 1790s that the Catholics were able to actually build a church. And on or near that location where the cabin built to be used as a house of worship once stood, now stands St. Mary's Catholic Church, built in 1845.
Regardless, the origin and reason for the name Shadow of Death is left as a purely speculative debate with no trace records for a reason. But spectacularly enough, this little area in Shade Gap does have an overwhelmingly spooky and dark feeling as you pass through it. Nothing you can quite put a finger on, and nothing overly frightening, just extremely peaceful, and at times a little off. If you ever get the chance, stop right before or right after this location and park your car. Take extreme care walking along the highway, but give a little walk and see if maybe you can feel the oddness of the Shadow of Death. I hope you enjoyed this visit to a location that garnered an actual historical marker and has no fundamental history to tell us about for this area known as the Shadow of Death. Leave a comment below if you know of other locations like the Shadow of Death. Remember, click like and give me a subscribe for more ODDySEEy stories of who we once were. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.